This is the beginning of part 2 of our module FX Options, which introduces options on foreign exchange and the basic approach to pricing them using either the Black-Scholes formula or binomial trees, and which introduces the principal factor sensitivities of FX options. We remind you that this part 2 contains chapters 3 and 4 of the module, with chapter 3 teaching you how to price FX options using binomial trees, and chapter 4 containing 6 quiz questions to test your understanding of these materials. This chapter 3 shows you how to price options using binomial trees and explains the advantages and disadvantages of this approach. Among the advantages is the ability to price a wider spectrum of options than simple European ones, including American-style options and many exotic options, which will be discussed in our more advanced modules. The binomial tree approach begins by stipulating that over a short time interval, the spot rate will move from its present level to one of two possible levels, symmetrically more or less distributed around the forward rate for that interval. These two levels are generally referred to as up and down, and must be consistent with a number of parameters defined in the model, including the expected volatility of the currency over that time interval. The theory behind the math that we will be applying is a little complex and left for another dedicated module, but it starts by writing for up exponential, or e to the power, RT minus RB, the difference between the two rates, minus sigma squared over 2, adjusted for the time interval by multiplying by t, plus sigma square root of t. And for down, the exact same formula, except that the plus square root of t term has been replaced by a minus. To provide some intuitive guidance on how these formulas work, you should note first that if you set the volatility, sigma, to 0, you get u equals d equals e to the power RT minus RB to the power t, which you should recognize is the term by which you need to multiply the spot to obtain the forward for the specified time interval. Already this part of the intuition says that in a world with no volatility, currencies move to their forward. You should next note that in the formula for up, the vol term at the end, as we pointed out earlier, is added to the rest of the expression, while for down, it is subtracted. Intuitively, what the model is saying is that the spot is expected on average to trend towards its forward by the end of the time interval, but that at any moment in time, bullish or bearish news may come along, and the effect of bullish news would be positive for the currency relative to that forward level, while the impact of bearish news would be negative relative to that forward level. Next, you should note the square root of time adjustment to the vol at the end of the formula, which converts the annualized vol to the one that is actually appropriate for the specific time interval, a property of volatility we discussed earlier in this module. The explanation of the sigma squared over 2 term, unfortunately, is a little complex and has been left for the downloadable PDF attached to this module. Finally, we use these terms U and D for up and down quite simply by multiplying the spot level at any moment by the values of U and D to obtain the next two possible values allowed under the model. Having set the parameters for the two possible movements per interval in the spot rate, which we have programmed in the spreadsheet as up and down, the binomial tree approach proceeds to map out all possible paths that the currency can take from the trade date until the expiration date, assuming a 50-50 probability at any one step that the next move could be either up or down. This worksheet, Tree Spot, shows the mapping of these paths assuming the 6-month tenor of the option has been divided into 6 intervals, each approximately 1 month long. In practice, the intervals are set to be much shorter, which increases the model's accuracy, but also increases the size of the tree and makes it harder, obviously, to fit into our small screen. As you click your way through the formulas of the tree, you should take note of the following. First, note that this cell here, I8, measures the length of each interval, not the total tenor of the option. The total tenor of the option, of course, is input in cell D6. The point at which one of these intervals finishes and the next one starts will be referred to as a node. When standing at any particular point in the tree, for example this point here, roughly halfway through the life of this option, the cell immediately to your right represents the up movement of the spot, calculated as previously mentioned by multiplying the cell F14, the current spot, by the up factor in cell I6. The cell immediately underneath where we are represents the down movement of the spot from the previous level, calculated, of course, by multiplying cell F14, the current spot, by the down factor shown in cell I7. So, as another example, if you are standing at cell E16, then F16 represents the value of the spot 1 period later, assuming the currency went up, whereas F17 represents that value if the currency went down. Also, since we know from mathematics that S times U times D equals S times D times U, the spot level under many different paths of the tree reaches the same final level, which diminishes enormously the necessary number of nodes and outcomes in the tree. Hence the name recombining tree that is commonly used by quants. The more mathematically inclined may recognize that a recombining tree would have only n plus 1 outcomes if it is divided into n intervals, while the non-recombining tree would have 2 to the power n outcomes. In the case of our present tree, which has 6 nodes, this means a difference between 7 and 64 outcomes. A third observation is that we can associate a probability with each outcome based on simple multiplication and the use of what we call in mathematics combinatorials. We will skip the details here, except to point out, for the more mathematical, that the probability of arriving at any one level at the maturity date is 6ck times 0.5 to the power 6, or n if we have n intervals, where k ranges from 0 to 6, the 0 corresponding to the highest final outcome and the 6 to the lowest final outcome. Finally, you will note that the 7 final outcomes you see in cells I14 to I20 range from pretty high to pretty low, since to reach I14, for instance, the spot must experience 6 up moves in a row, while to reach I20, the spot must experience 6 down moves in a row. Note also that the middle outcome at expiration in the cell I17 is approximately equal to the 6-month forward appearing in I5. In fact, by the very way we have defined up and down, we are mathematically certain to find that the distribution of all possible final outcomes is roughly symmetrically distributed around the outright forward rate. On this worksheet, PDF, which stands for Probability Distribution Function, you see a graph which plots the final outcomes for Stirling spot against their probabilities given by the height for each of these points. This graph is derived from a table that lies directly underneath, which is the same one as before, but now includes the probabilities calculated as explained above. This graph can help deepen your understanding of option pricing by helping you visualize what happens as you change either of the interest rates or the volatility. Resetting all our variables first to our original ones, we begin by increasing the term interest rate from 5% to 8%. We know that this will increase the forward, and we see that in the shift of the entire graph to the right. And vice versa, if I reduce the term or sterling interest rate, dollar, beg your pardon, interest rate, for example, to 2%. Resetting the term interest rate to 5%, and now increasing the base interest rate to 8%, would, in the formula for the forward, reduce the forward and therefore would shift the entire graph to the left. And vice versa if instead I had reduced the base rate from 5 to 2%, causing the whole graph to shift to the right. Perhaps most importantly, increasing volatility from this current 10% to, let's say, 20% widens the graph and spreads the final outcomes over a broader range, this time a range that seems to go from just over 1 to almost 2, although we cannot see the very final and highest value given the size of this graph. Reducing volatility to, let's say, 5%, you can now anticipate, would cause this graph to narrow very significantly and become very much clustered around the forward. In fact, if we reset the 2% here exactly around the forward of 1.5, but this time with the highest and the lowest values ranging from, as you can see, for the low, 137, and for the high, only 163, significantly less wide a range than we had originally. It is really this last observation which illustrates best the critical importance of volatility for the pricing of options, since extreme values at expiration of the option can be reached more easily when vol is high than when vol is low. We are ready to move to the most important part of the binomial model, for which we turn to this worksheet called Final Payoff. If we start in the last column of our tree for the spot, we can of course calculate the option's value or payoff on this date since we have reached expiration. This is simply, as you know by now, the final spot value minus the strike in the case of a call, or 0 if this difference is negative, or the strike minus the final spot value in the case of a put, or again 0 if this difference is negative. Each of these two formulas can be and has been programmed into the worksheet, and on this worksheet we do this for initially just the European call by adding a new column for this payoff, as you can see directly underneath our existing tree, in which you can see the formula we just mentioned by clicking on any cell and hitting F2. We have in fact hidden the original entries at the top of the worksheet to preserve space. You will not be surprised to see zeros at the bottom of the new column, since these correspond to a final spot below 1.5, our strike, and therefore the call option has expired out of the money. Nor should you be surprised to see the rising level of the payoff above those cells, since the three positive numbers we just highlighted here correspond to final spot prices for sterling that leave the call deeper and deeper in the money. In essence, we are now ready to price the option, and our final remaining step could be quite simply to take each of these outcomes, multiply it by its probability, which we already have, add those things together, getting effectively the expected payoff of the option at maturity, and then finally discounting to the present to obtain the option's premium, under the principle that an option's premium should equal, in a perfectly priced universe, the discounted value of its probability-adjusted final payoff. This would actually lead us to the fastest solution, but we will take a slightly longer route, which will facilitate some of our calculations when dealing with American options later. Under this alternative approach, we start at the final column of the second table, and then step one column to the left of the cells that show the final payoffs, so in this case at node 5, and calculate the value of the option at this particular node as simply the present value of the arithmetical average of the two possible values one interval later. So for example, if I'm standing, just to repeat, at this cell I23, we would calculate the option's value at this node 5 as half of the sum of these two numbers here, discounted at 5% for just 1 month. And that amount would come to, and you'll soon see it appearing on the screen, 0.2284, which looks just about right, since the midpoint between the two numbers you see here is around 22.23, and a little discounting brings us to 22.84 as mentioned. Please note that the use of the arithmetical average is just another way of recognizing the 50-50 probability of moving up or down in any one interval. Because under this approach we work from the last column backward, this method is known as the backward induction method. More generally, we can program the formula we just mentioned into Excel for all cells in this column under the number 5, as can be seen in this worksheet labeled backward induction. Note that the number of cells in this new column is only 6, so one less than the number of cells in the final column, for reasons you should have no difficulty figuring out. A very astute listener will have noted that we should really have discounted using the exponential function, since we are dealing with continuously compounded interest rates. But the difference is not significant, so we will not worry about it. We chose here to use the more traditional method of discounting because our time node, still being 1 month, is really too long to be consistent with the assumption of continuous compounding. Our last step, which you can probably anticipate by now, is to repeat the backward induction interval by interval until we reach one single initial value for the call at inception in cell D23. This new worksheet, European Call Pricing, does exactly what we just described. And as you can see, the call premium comes to 0.0401, which compares to, you may recall, 0.0413 under worksheet GK. This is a small enough difference and would become smaller still as you increase the number of nodes in your tree, and also if you used exponential discounting rather than the simpler approach that we chose here. If you decide to build your own worksheet with a larger number of nodes, please make sure in cell I7, which is a hidden cell that has the time interval, if you recall, to change the denominator in the formula as necessary, since this is one thing we cannot pre-program easily. Turning to puts, if I want to price a European put option, I would presumably only need to change the formula for the payoff at maturity to reflect a puts payoff, hence the strike comes before the spot, and then proceed exactly as before using the backward induction method. This worksheet, European Put Pricing, contains a tree with essentially the same formulas as for the call right underneath that for the call, which we have hidden due to scarcity of space, except, as we pointed out, for the reversal of the spot and strike in this one column, column J. And again, the premium turns out to be 0.0401, exactly the same as for the call, which should not be surprising in view of put-call parity. It may be worth testing the put-call parity principle again, but in a more general case, when the strike of the two options is not equal to the forward. So let us, for example, set the strike at 155, which is currently 150, as you may recall. For this, we need to unhide some of the hidden rows, change the strike to 155, and then, in the interest of space, hide those rows once again. You may have noticed at the bottom of this particular worksheet a number of additional cells that were not there before, which reproduce the call price, the put price, the difference between the call and the put, and finally the present value of the forward minus strike item. And exactly consistent with put-call parity, having lifted the strike as much as we did, the value of the call has dropped. The value of the put, of course, would have risen. Call minus put now is a negative item equal to negative 0.0488, which is exactly equal to the discounting of the difference between the forward and the strike. So the identity has been confirmed perfectly once again. Where the binomial tree approach really becomes valuable is in pricing options that cannot be priced using Black-Scholes, Garman-Kohlhagen, or any other closed-end formula. American options provide an important example of this. For reasons beyond the scope of this module, the Black-Scholes model is in fact unable to price any option that can be exercised prior to maturity at any time, so definitely struggles with American options. The binomial tree approach to these options can be summarized in 3 sentences. First, proceed just as before to develop your trees for the evolution of the spot price and for the value of a European option at each node of the tree. New step 2, compare the value at each node that you just calculated with the payoff that the option holder would have if he chose to exercise his option at that point instead of keeping it alive until maturity. And the fairly logical step 3, if this latter amount exceeds the value that you calculated under step 1 for the European option, or stated differently, if the option is worth more being exercised there and then rather than being kept alive, then you should substitute the latter amount in that cell for the European option value. You are assuming in effect that the irrational holder of this option would exercise it at that point and get the higher amount rather than keeping it alive for what is a lower amount. Worksheet American call pricing shows how this is done using the simple Excel operator max once again. Cell I-21, for example, reveals a formula that instructs the software to choose the higher of the value of this option if it were European, where you should readily recognize the previous formula we had for European calls, versus its intrinsic value, i.e. its payoff if it were exercised immediately. If you click on especially the top row in this worksheet within this tree and compare it to the top row of the worksheet for European calls, you should find that several of the cells towards the top part of this tree have increased slightly in value when incorporating the early exercise possibility. Just to confirm for certain that this is the case, note, for example, that if we ask Excel just to add these top 2 rows together, just not counting the initial value of the American call in D21, at the bottom of the slide, Excel informs us that the sum of these 12 numbers adds up to 148.19, whereas back for the European call, these same values came only to 147.61. The bottom part of the pricing tree has not really changed very much, since obviously a number of zeros for the European call have also remained zeros in the case of the American call. But nor have they gone down, and therefore, since some values in this tree for the American call have risen while others have merely remained the same, the aggregate effect is to cause the price for this American option in cell D21 to rise just a little bit to 0.0403 versus 0.0401 in the case of the European call. Presumably you can work out how to build a tree for pricing an American put option. The lower tree in this worksheet for American put pricing is identical to the one from American call pricing, except that it reverses, as you might expect, the formula for the option's payoff at maturity, both in this final column and in the calculation of the gain realizable upon early exercise in each of the preceding columns, where you now see the strike being followed by the spot, or rather the spot being subtracted from the strike, exactly as you would expect. You will see here that the value of the American put has come out to be 0.0405, which again is slightly higher than for a European put, where the price was 0.0401. You might ask whether the small difference between an American call and an American put, 0.0403 versus 0.0405, you may recall, does it violate put-call parity? The answer is absolutely not. Put-call parity applies only to European options, since the combination of a long European call and a short European put is a synthetic forward, since one and only one option will be exercised at expiration. If I, however, combine a long American call and a short American put, I simply do not get a synthetic forward, since it is entirely possible that both the call and the put might get exercised, but at different times. And this makes this second combination entirely different from any forward that you might envisage. We turn finally to a comparison of pricing properties for European and American options and see what general principles, if any, we can establish. Just this one time, to increase the level of accuracy of our binomial tree model, we have built trees on this worksheet comparison that actually have 26 nodes each for the four types of options that we will be analyzing: European puts and calls and American puts and calls. We have hidden numerous trees underneath the main panel in the worksheet, but of course you can find them on the downloadable Excel attachment and go through them if you wish. We simply reproduce here the pricing of each option that we priced previously, using both the binomial trees method in this box visible at the bottom left here, as well as the values we had originally calculated under Garmin Kohlhagen in this box on the right here. The first thing to note in this worksheet is that the values of the European options have come much closer now than to the original values under Garmin Kohlhagen. And this is due to the increased number of nodes, which enhance the precision of the binomial tree model. In fact, it can be proven mathematically that if the number of nodes is increased towards infinity, the binomial tree approach converges on the Garmin Kohlhagen approach, in fact becomes mathematically identical to it when the number of nodes reaches infinity. We also note that the American options do not seem to have really much greater value than their European counterparts, results we have seen already once before. This will generally be true for options on currencies whose yield is comparable, as we have initially input here. But it ceases to be true when we allow the yield of the underlying asset's currency to significantly exceed the other currency's yield. Suppose, for example, that we reset the sterling interest rate to 8% in the cell E8. We now see that the European call is worth 0.0313, while the American call is worth 0.0336, significantly more. Note, though, that the European put and the American put are actually still worth virtually exactly the same, or exactly the same to 4 decimals as shown here. But if we now switch around the 5 and the 8 here, so that the term currency interest rate is now the expensive one, as it were, and the underlying asset, sterling, yields the lower yield, everything just about flips around. The calls, whether European or American, are pretty much still worth the same as one another, but it is now the puts which differ, with the American put becoming worth significantly more than the European put. There is a complex mathematical proof for this relationship, but the simple way to understand it is that it would be irrational to exercise an American option early if the yield on the underlying asset that will be delivered to you upon exercise is smaller than the yield of the currency that you must deliver. So to exercise the sterling call option at 150, the owner would need to borrow dollars at 5% to purchase pounds yielding, let's say, 8%, which would make some sense. Whereas it would make no sense to early exercise the option if sterling yields 5% while US dollars yield 8%. Even when the two yields are comparable, there is no real benefit to borrow at one rate to purchase the other currency and get pretty much the same yield, while exercising the American option would mean giving up the limited downside that an option offers without getting anything worth much in return. You can derive an explanation for the effect we observed for the sterling put by simply remembering that a sterling put is the same as a dollar call. We now return to an examination of how lengthening the option's tenor affects the value of European and American options. This is done by going back to the worksheet and setting the dollar rate at 5%, but this time the sterling rate at 8% for a reason, and gradually extending the maturity of the options from half a year to 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, and finally 20 years. The table here summarizes the results, but you should confirm your agreement with these numbers by working directly in the worksheet when you have the time. We are not surprised, of course, to see the European call initially gain in value as its tenor is lengthened, until it peaks around 2 to 3 years and begins declining in value after that. As explained previously, This is the point at which the benefit of the longer tenor for allowing the underlying currency to rise above the strike is more than offset by the discounting effect over a longer and longer period. Nor are we surprised that the American call is worth more than the European call for all tenors, and becomes increasingly valuable relative to the European option as the tenor is extended further, given the 8% higher yield available on sterling, and therefore the attraction of exercising early to earn the 3% positive carry. And we should not be surprised either that for the American call, the premium generally seems to increase without limitation as we increase the tenor from half a year to 10 years, unlike the European option. This is easy to intuit by simply noting that an American option of 10 years has all the rights of an American option of 5 years, say, plus 5 additional years of rights to exercise. It cannot, therefore, possibly be cheaper than the 5-year option. We can resort to a no arbitrage type of argument for a more formal proof. Assume two American options are otherwise identical, except for their tenors, T1 and T2, being such that T1 is greater than T2. Assume, however, that P1 is less than P2, where P1 and P2 are the premia, respectively, of these two options. An arbitrageur now sells option 2 and purchases option 1. He pockets an upfront net premium equal to P2 minus P1 and finds himself long option 1 and short option 2. If during the shorter period T2, option 2 is exercised against him, he exercises option 1 as well, and therefore is fully hedged. He has neither a gain nor a loss from the exercises, but he walks away with the upfront net premium he collected initially. And obviously, if option 2 is not exercised during this shorter period T2, then at the end of this period, and for the remaining time left, which is equal to T1 minus T2, he is still long option 1, he is no longer short option 2, and he still has the upfront net premium he collected initially. So again, he is ahead. Therefore, if our original assumption that P1 could be less than P2 were true, we would have created a money machine for the arbitrageur, and therefore this initial assumption that P1 could be smaller than P2 must be false. That being said, if we return to our pricing grid, it does seem as if the 20-year American call is cheaper than the 10-year American call. And if you extend the tenor to 100 years, you will see the price appear to decline enormously. And if finally you extend the tenor to 1,000 years, you would find the American call becoming worthless. How can this be? In fact, our no arbitrage argument on the previous slide is completely airtight. The American option cannot ever become cheaper as its tenor is lengthened. But our binomial tree, which splits the tenor into only 26 intervals, becomes increasingly unreliable and almost silly when you apply it to a 100-year option, where each interval becomes almost 4 years long. At a point like this, the model has essentially broken down completely and has started spitting out garbage. If you go back and you increase the number of nodes to 1,000, let's say, you will see the prices behaving exactly as we had predicted. But please don't try to do this unless you have lots of spare time. This concludes this module on basic FX options, leaving only the 6 quiz questions in Chapter 4.